Picture this: a shadowy figure strides through the cobblestone streets of a 14th century town, the air thick with the scent of decay and burning herbs. Cloaked head to toe in black, their face hidden behind a long, haunting beak of a mask, this is the plague doctor, an image that sends chills even centuries later. But here's the question that lingers like fog over a graveyard. Why did these eerie, almost otherworldly masks become the enduring symbol of one of history's deadliest pandemics? What secrets lie behind that hollow-eyed gaze and that grotesque, bird-like snout? The Black Death swept through Europe like a nightmare, wiping out nearly half the continent's population in just a few years. And in the midst of that terror, these masked figures became both feared and revered, walking enigmas tasked with confronting death itself. But their masks weren't just for show. Every curve, every stitch held purpose. Some say the beak was stuffed with herbs to ward off bad air. Others whisper it was meant to mimic divine beings, intermediaries between the living and the dead. The truth, it's darker, stranger, and far more fascinating than you might think. This is the story of how a simple medical tool became a cultural icon, a symbol of fear, and even a twisted kind of hope. We'll unravel the myths, dig into the macabre design choices, and uncover why this unsettling image still captivates us today. From the grim realities of medieval medicine to the mask's shocking reinventions in modern pop culture, this isn't just a tale of the past, it's a mystery that echoes into our own time. So, ready to step into the shadows and uncover the truth behind history's most haunting mask? Let's begin. The streets of 14th century Europe were scenes of unimaginable horror. The Black Death didn't just kill, it devoured, spreading with terrifying speed and leaving entire cities hollowed out in its wake. By some estimates, as many as 200 million lives were lost, a number so staggering it reshaped societies, economies, and even the way people saw the world. Entire villages vanished overnight, the living abandoned the dying. Parents turned away from their own children in desperation. This wasn't just a disease, it was a force of nature, an unstoppable wave of suffering that made people question if the end of days had truly come. In the face of such devastation, fear wasn't just an emotion, it was the air people breathed, and that fear birthed some of history's most desperate measures. With no understanding of germs or contagion, people grasped at anything that might offer protection. They burned barrels of tar in the streets, hoping the smoke would purify the air. They scrawled prayers on doorways, carried amulets, and even blamed outsiders, leading to brutal pogroms against minorities. But none of it worked. The plague kept spreading, and the dead kept piling up faster than they could be buried. Enter the plague doctors, part physicians, part last hope. Hired by panicked towns to tend to the sick, these men were often second-rate healers, cobbling together whatever knowledge they had in a world where medicine was still steeped in superstition. There was no cure, no real treatment. All they could do was witness the suffering firsthand, moving through the carnage like grim specters in their waxed cloaks and those infamous beaked masks. But why the masks? Why the unsettling, almost theatrical costumes? That's where the story takes a darker turn, revealing just how little they understood and how much they were willing to believe. The plague doctor's mask wasn't just a barrier, it was a desperate gamble built on a terrifyingly flawed idea. That disease traveled through bad air, a poisonous miasma that could be filtered or even fooled. The long beak, stuffed with herbs like cloves, rosemary, and myrrh, a fragrant shield against death itself. The glass eye coverings, meant to protect the wearer from the evil gaze of the infected. Even the heavy robes dripping with wax were less about hygiene and more about warding off unseen forces. Every detail was a prayer disguised as science, a last stand against a foe they couldn't comprehend. And yet, for all their futility, these masks became something more. In the eyes of the terrified public, plague doctors were both saviors and omens. Their arrival meant help was coming, or that death had already marked the house. That duality, that eerie power, is why the image stuck. The mask wasn't just a tool. It was a symbol, a visual shorthand for the helplessness and horror of an era that knew only one truth. When the beak-faced doctor knocked, someone inside was already doomed. Long before the beaked mask became infamous, plague doctors looked nothing like the nightmarish figures we imagine today. The earliest records show these physicians dressed far more plainly. No eerie beak, no waxed robes, just the ordinary garb of medieval healers. One of the first depictions comes from a manuscript in the late 1400s, showing a doctor in a simple hooded cloak, his face uncovered as he examines a patient. Another illustration from the outbreak in Paris in 1580 shows healers wearing little more than veils over their mouths, a far cry from the theatrical costumes that would later define them. So what changed? Why did the plague doctor's appearance evolve into something so deliberately terrifying? The shift wasn't just about function, it was about fear. Early in the pandemics, doctors relied on basic precautions like vinegar-soaked cloths or holding aromatic posies to their noses, desperate attempts to block the stench of decay and what they believed were poisonous vapors. But as death tolls climbed and panic set in, towns needed more than healers, they needed symbols. Authorities began mandating special uniforms, turning these physicians into walking warnings. A Toulouse ordinance from 1621 ordered plague doctors to carry a white rod, signaling their grim duty, while others required red cloaks to make them instantly recognizable. The mask came later, a dramatic escalation in a battle against an invisible enemy. And here's the twist, that iconic beak wasn't even originally designed for plague work. The concept borrowed from an unlikely source: Renaissance metalworking. Blacksmiths wore elongated leather masks to filter toxic fumes, a design that caught the eye of desperate physicians. By the 1600s, the plague doctor's uniform crystallized into the haunting figure we know. The beaked mask stuffed with herbs, the heavy leather hood, the glass-eyed stare. It was equal parts medical tool and psychological weapon, a costume meant to intimidate as much as protect, both a barrier against disease and a stark reminder of its presence. Yet even then, the mask's effectiveness was dubious at best. Some accounts describe doctors collapsing mid-visit, their fragrant herb pouches doing little against the real killer. Others tell of townspeople fleeing at the sight of them, not out of respect but raw terror. The plague doctor had become a paradox, a healer whose very appearance signaled hopelessness. And that duality, more than any medical purpose, is why the image endured long after the pandemics faded. The mask wasn't just armor, it was theater, a macabre performance in humanity's oldest play, the fight against the unknown. The year 1619 marked a turning point in the plague doctor's haunting legacy, thanks to one man, Charles de Lorme, personal physician to French royalty and a man obsessed with outsmarting death. Faced with the horrors of repeated outbreaks, de Lorme didn't just tweak existing designs. He crafted something entirely new, a costume so unsettling it would etch itself into history. His creation, the full plague doctor ensemble, cloak, gloves, hat, and that infamous beak mask, a head-to-toe barrier against the invisible menace. But what's often forgotten is that de Lorme wasn't just stitching together random horrors. Every detail, from the leather's thickness to the beak's curve, was a calculated response to the medical theories of his time. At the heart of his design lay miasma theory, the belief that disease traveled through foul air, a notion that had gripped Europe for centuries. De Lorme's mask was essentially a wearable filter, its long beak stuffed with a pungent blend of herbs like lavender, mint, and camphor, materials thought to purify bad air before it reached the wearer's lungs. The logic was eerily poetic. If plague floated like a poison mist, why not fight it with fragrance? Even the mask's leather exterior, soaked in wax and vinegar, was meant to repel miasma like a shield. But there was another layer to de Lorme's thinking, one that reveals just how deeply fear shaped medicine. The beak wasn't just practical, it was psychological. De Lorme knew the terror his appearance would provoke, and he leaned into it. In an era when people believed the plague could strike through a glance or a breath, his mask acted as a visual deterrent, keeping panicked crowds at arm's length. The glass eye coverings, they served a dual purpose, protecting against corrupt air, while also hiding the doctor's expression, preventing patients from seeing despair in his eyes. Every element was a performance, a way to project authority in the face of chaos. Yet for all its ingenuity, de Lorme's design had a grim irony. The very theory it relied on, miasma, was utterly wrong. Plague wasn't carried by air but by fleas on rats, a fact no amount of herb-stuffed beaks could change. Some historians argue the mask might have even worsened the crisis, giving doctors false confidence to walk into infected zones unprotected. And there's another twist. Though de Lorme's name is forever tied to the mask, he likely didn't invent it from scratch. Earlier prototypes existed in Italy, where metalworker masks inspired the design. What de Lorme did was refine it, branding it as medical necessity, and in doing so, he turned a makeshift tool into an icon of despair. The legacy of his creation outlived both the plagues and the flawed science behind it. By the 18th century, the beaked mask had transcended medicine, appearing in art, theater, and even political satire. It became shorthand for death's inevitability, a costume so potent it still sends shivers down spines today. De Lorme's mask succeeded in ways he never intended, not as a cure but as a symbol, a reminder that when faced with the unknown, humanity will cling to any lifeline, even one as haunting as a leather-clad bird's face staring back from the shadows. Imagine living in a world where the very air you breathed could kill you, where the scent of rotting flesh or the stench of stagnant water wasn't just unpleasant but deadly. This was the terrifying reality behind miasma theory, the idea that dominated medical thought for centuries. From ancient Greece through the Renaissance, physicians and scholars clung to the belief that disease spread through bad air, poisonous vapors rising from swamps, corpses, or even the exhaled breaths of the sick. The word malaria itself comes from the Italian for bad air, a testament to how deeply this idea was woven into humanity's understanding of illness. At the height of the plague, this theory wasn't just speculation, it was gospel. Medical texts warned of night air thick with corruption, and cities burned barrels of pitch and sulfur to cleanse the atmosphere. Even the famed physician Galen wrote of pestilential vapors that could imbalance the body's humors. When faced with an invisible killer, people latched onto what they could perceive: the choking smoke of mass graves, the reek of overflowing sewers. If disease smelled foul, then surely fragrance could fight it. Enter the plague doctor's beak, a desperate solution steeped in this logic. Stuffed with a carefully curated blend of herbs like juniper, ambergris, and storax, the mask was essentially a wearable censer, turning the doctor's every breath into a ritual of purification. Historical accounts describe these mixtures with near religious reverence. One 16th-century manual recommended 55 different ingredients, including rose petals, cinnamon, and bizarrely, dried viper flesh. The longer the beak, the more distance between the doctor and the poisoned air, giving the herbs more time to cleanse it before inhalation. But here's the tragic irony. While miasma theory was utterly wrong, it wasn't entirely baseless. Rotting organic matter does breed disease, just not in the way medieval healers imagined. The stench of plague-ridden cities often came from the same rats and fleas that carried the actual pathogen. In a cruel twist, some of the herbs used in those beak masks, like lavender and thyme, did have mild insect-repellent properties, meaning doctors might have been partially protected but for entirely the wrong reasons. The legacy of miasma theory lingers in unexpected places. Long after germ theory replaced it, the instinct to associate foul smells with danger persisted. During 19th century cholera outbreaks, Londoners still blamed miasmatic fog, while hospitals burned herbs for disinfection. Even today, the idea of fresh air as healing echoes this ancient fear. The plague doctor's beak, then, was more than a medical tool. It was a physical manifestation of humanity's struggle to confront the unseen, a leather-clad monument to our oldest instinct: when in doubt, follow your nose. The plague doctor's mask was a masterpiece of macabre engineering, every inch designed to wage war against an enemy no one could see. Take the leather, thick, waxed, and meticulously stitched. This wasn't just about durability, it was a barrier against the imagined toxicity of the air itself. Leather, treated with vinegar or camphor, created a seal against the outside world, a second skin meant to repel death's touch. And then there were the glass eyepieces, small round lenses set into the mask like the unblinking eyes of an owl. Far from mere decoration, these were early attempts at eye protection, shielding the doctor from the corrupt vapors believed to enter through the gaze. Some accounts even describe the glass being tinted red or amber, thought to neutralize the evil humors radiating from the sick. But the beak, the mask's most infamous feature, was where desperation and ingenuity collided. Measuring up to 15 inches long, it wasn't just a grotesque flourish. Inside that hollow curve lay a labyrinth of aromatic defenses. Layers of lavender, cloves, and rose petals were packed tight, sometimes mixed with more bizarre additives like crushed emeralds or dried toad skin. The idea was simple. As air entered the beak's tip, it would pass through this herbal filter, emerging purified by the time it reached the doctor's nostrils. Some designs even included small vents or perforations to regulate airflow, turning the mask into a primitive respirator. Yet for all its meticulous construction, the mask straps tell another story, one of human fallibility. Made of simple leather or cloth, they were often tied hastily, leaving gaps where miasma could seep in. Survivors' journals describe doctors adjusting their masks mid-treatment, their fingers trembling as they tightened knots. Even the wax coating, meant to repel fluids, would crack under heat or wear, rendering the armor porous. And here's the cruel irony. The very herbs meant to save them sometimes triggered allergic reactions, causing wearers to sneeze or cough, actions believed to invite disease. What's fascinating isn't just how the mask failed, but how its design reflected the limits of human knowledge. The straps, a concession to comfort in hours-long shifts among the dying. The glass eyepieces, as much about concealing the doctor's fear as protecting it. Even the beak's length varied by region, shorter in crowded cities where mobility mattered, longer in rural areas where symbolism outweighed practicality. This wasn't just medical gear, it was a mirror held up to an era's terror, a physical manifestation of the question haunting every plague-stricken town: how do you fight what you can't see? The answer, it turns out, was theater as much as science. Some historians argue the mask's true function was psychological, to convince both wearer and patient that something, anything, was being done. In a world where most treatments involved bloodletting or rubbing onions on the skin, the plague doctor's costume was a performance of control. The creak of leather, the rustle of herbs, the hollow stare of those glass eyes, all designed to project authority in the face of chaos. And perhaps that's why the image endures, not because it worked, but because it represents humanity's oldest instinct. When faced with the abyss, we'll fashion a mask and dare it to blink first. Inside the plague doctor's beak lay a bizarre apothecary, a carefully curated blend of botanicals that promised salvation through scent. Rosemary, sharp and pine-like, was thought to purify the blood and ward off pestilential vapors. Mint, with its crisp freshness, wasn't just for breath. It was believed to cool the body's overheated humors, counteracting the feverish corruption of plague. Myrrh, sticky and resinous, carried biblical weight. Its smoky aroma was said to drive out evil spirits clinging to the sick. These weren't random choices. Each herb was selected like a soldier for battle, armed with centuries of folk wisdom and flawed medical theory. But the recipes grew stranger. Some masks contained camphor, a pungent crystalline powder stolen from laurel trees, prized for its ability to repel decay. Others packed in cloves, their eugenol-rich oils numbing the nose, a desperate attempt to block the stench of death. Juniper berries, crushed and dried, added a gin-like sharpness, believed to cut through miasma like a knife through fog. Even rose petals found their way into the mix, not for their beauty but for their association with the Virgin Mary, turning the beak into a kind of walking reliquary. The most shocking ingredient, ambergris whale vomit harvested from beaches, aged by salt and sun until it emitted a musky sweetness. Medieval perfumers swore it could fix other scents, making their protection last longer. There's grim poetry in doctors sniffing a substance born from a creature's suffering while surrounded by human agony. And then there were the outright superstitions, storax resin to confuse malignant spirits, or even flecks of dried snake flesh, thought to mirror the serpent's ability to shed illness with its skin. What's haunting isn't just the futility of these remedies, but the logic behind them. In an era before germ theory, smell was health. Aromatic equaled safe, foul equaled fatal. When a plague doctor leaned over a patient, the herbs in his beak did more than filter air. They screamed, "This air is clean. This air won't kill you." Never mind that the real threat scurried under floorboards in the form of rat fleas. The mask's scent was a placebo for both wearer and victim, a fragrant lie that let them pretend, just for a moment, that control was possible. Yet buried in the pseudoscience was a sliver of accidental wisdom. Some of these herbs, like thyme and lavender, actually repel insects. The same fleas that carried Yersinia pestis avoid their oils. So while doctors died clutching miasma theory, their masks may have offered faint protection for reasons they'd never understand. A twist of fate as bitter as the herbs they breathed. Right defense, wrong enemy. The beak's true legacy isn't in what it prevented, but in what it revealed: how fear turns even flowers into armor, and how desperation can make a perfume out of hope. The plague doctor's mask may have been the most haunting part of the ensemble, but the rest of the costume was just as deliberate and just as futile. Underneath that beaked facade lay layers of protection crafted from paranoia and desperation. The robe, often made of heavy linen or goat leather, wasn't just clothing, it was a fortress, drenched in wax, sometimes mixed with fragrant resins like benzoin. The fabric became stiff and repellent, a literal second skin meant to shrug off the poisonous air clinging to the sick. Some accounts describe robes being dyed black, not for mourning, but because the dye process involved vinegar and salt substances believed to fix the fabric's protective properties. Then came the gloves, usually crafted from the same waxed leather as the mask, extending past the wrists to seal out contamination. Doctors would tuck the sleeves of their robes into these gauntlets, creating a continuous barrier from neck to fingertip. The irony: many plague treatments required direct contact, lancing buboes or applying poultices, forcing physicians to remove the gloves mid-visit, rendering the whole ritual useless. Even the boots followed the same logic, knee-high and layered with animal fat. They were less about practicality and more about the illusion of total enclosure. But it's the hat that reveals the costume's darkest psychology. Plague doctors wore wide-brimmed, low-sloping head coverings, often in somber black. At first glance, it seems like mere shade from the sun until you learn these hats were sometimes lined with mercury-soaked felt. Mercury, a toxic heavy metal, was thought to absorb pestilential vapors before they could reach the wearer's head. Doctors would press the brim low over their masked faces, creating a shadowed void where the eyes should be, turning themselves into faceless reapers hovering at the sick. Every stitch of this outfit screamed one idea: separation. The waxed robes to repel miasma, the gloves to avoid touch, the boots to ward off ground vapors, the hat to shield the mind. Yet in practice, the costume was a death trap. The heavy leather trapped body heat, speeding dehydration in already sweltering plague wards. The wax melted in summer, sticking to the wearer's skin, while in winter it cracked, exposing gaps. And the herbs, their scent masked the rot of dying patients, lulling doctors into false security as fleas hopped unseen from corpse to cloak. This wasn't just clothing. It was a full-body metaphor for medieval medicine's greatest flaw, the desperate need to believe that if you could look protected, you were protected. The plague doctor's costume fed that illusion, its every element a performance of control in a world spiraling into chaos. And perhaps that's why the image endures not as a relic of science but as a mirror. A reminder that when faced with the unimaginable, we'll dress our fears in leather and wax and call it armor. The plague doctor's costume was a masterpiece of misguided confidence, a suit of armor built to fight ghosts. On paper, every element seemed logical. The waxed robes to repel miasma, the herbs to purify the air, the gloves to avoid contamination. But in reality, this elaborate getup did little to stop the plague. In fact, it might have made things worse. Let's start with the mask's most glaring flaw: fleas. Yersinia pestis, the bacterium behind the Black Death, didn't float through the air. It hitched rides on rodents and their parasites. While doctors were busy sniffing lavender, fleas could easily jump from a dying patient's bedding onto those heavy leather robes. The very garments meant to protect them became Trojan horses carrying the enemy inside their defenses. Then there's the chilling psychological toll. Imagine being a sick, feverish patient, already half convinced death was at your doorstep, when a shadowy figure straight out of a nightmare looms over your bed. The glass eyes, the beak like some carrion bird. It's no wonder some victims died screaming before the doctor could even examine them. Historical accounts describe families barricading doors at the sight of these masked figures, not out of ingratitude but sheer terror. In Toulouse, officials had to issue decrees forbidding plague doctors from entering homes unannounced after too many incidents of panicked residents fleeing into the streets, spreading infection further. The costume's design also created dangerous blind spots. The narrow eye openings limited peripheral vision, making it harder to notice contaminated surfaces or avoid contact with the sick. Those cumbersome gloves, doctors often removed them to perform procedures, defeating their purpose entirely. And the waxed robes, while imposing, trapped heat and sweat, creating ideal conditions for bacteria to thrive. In Marseille during 1720, a group of plague doctors reported higher mortality rates among their ranks than ordinary nurses, likely because their suffocating outfits left them dehydrated and exhausted, weakening their immune systems. But the cruelest irony lies in the herbs themselves. While some, like mint and thyme, have mild antiseptic properties, their primary function was olfactory. They masked the stench of decay, making it easier for doctors to endure the horrors around them. Yet that very act of covering up the smell removed a critical survival instinct, the natural revulsion that might have kept them from lingering too long in infected areas. The costume didn't just fail, it backfired, turning its wearers into unwitting agents of the very disaster they sought to combat. And yet there's a haunting coda to this story. For all its flaws, the plague doctor's garb did one thing brilliantly. It symbolized resolve. In a time when many abandoned the sick, these masked figures kept walking into the darkness. Their costume may have been theater, but their courage wasn't. That's why the image endures, not as a relic of effective medicine, but as a testament to humanity's unyielding, if sometimes misguided, will to fight. Long after the last plague doctor hung up their mask, the eerie silhouette of that beaked figure refused to fade into history. Instead, it slithered into the realm of myth and spectacle, finding new life in places far removed from its grim origins. The first stop on this macabre journey, the sunlit canals of Venice. By the 18th century, the city's infamous carnival had transformed the plague doctor's mask into a symbol of rebellion and anonymity. Revelers donned elongated beaks not to ward off disease, but to hide their identities while indulging in forbidden pleasures, gambling, scandalous affairs, even political dissent. The mask that once represented despair now became a tool of liberation. its hollow eyes staring out from a world where social rules no longer applied. But the costume's dark roots couldn't stay buried forever. As Gothic literature rose in the 19th century, writers seized on the plague doctor's haunting imagery. Edgar Allan Poe's The Masque of the Red Death featured a spectral figure draped in blood-stained robes, a clear nod to the beaked healers of the past. Bram Stoker flirted with the motif in early drafts of Dracula, imagining a shadowy physician who straddled the line between savior and omen. The mask had become shorthand for the uncanny, a visual cue that death itself was lurking just offstage. Fast forward to the 20th century, and the plague doctor evolved yet again, this time as a staple of horror cinema. Italian giallo films of the 1960s draped villains in leather masks, their beaks evoking surgical tools turned sinister. Then came video games, where the aesthetic found its most chilling reinvention. In Assassin's Creed Roman II, players encounter plague doctors skulking through Florence's alleyways, not as healers but as harbingers of conspiracy. The Dark Souls series turned them into twisted scholars, their beaks rusted and broken from centuries of futile research. Even children's media wasn't immune. Puss in Boots featured a plague doctor as a comically inept villain, proving the mask's versatility as both terror and farce. What's fascinating isn't just the mask's persistence, but its adaptability. Each era projects its fears onto that blank, bird-like visage. In the Renaissance, it was a barrier against miasma. For carnival-goers, a passport to freedom, modern horror casts it as the embodiment of humanity's oldest dread, the healer who cannot heal, the expert who cannot save. The plague doctor's mask endures because it's more than fabric and leather. It's a blank slate for our collective nightmares, ready to be filled with whatever frightens us next. And perhaps that's the ultimate irony. A tool designed to protect its wearer from disease has become a carrier of something else entirely. The virus of storytelling, mutating through centuries to infect our imagination. From the blood-soaked pages of Gothic novels to pixelated nightmares on a screen, the plague doctor walks on, never curing, never saving, but always watching. A relic that refuses to die because we keep breathing new life into it. Venice in the 18th century was a city of contradictions, opulent palaces rising from sinking foundations, sacred rituals masking profane indulgences, and a republic that prized liberty while clinging to rigid social hierarchies. It was here, amidst the swirling fog of carnival season, that the plague doctor's mask shed its grim medical past and took on a startling new role, a costume of rebellion. The transformation wasn't accidental. Venetian authorities had long used masks to enforce social equality during festivals, allowing nobles and commoners to mingle anonymously. But as the centuries wore on, the disguise became a weapon against convention. Enter the medico della peste, the plague doctor's distinctive beak now repurposed as the ultimate mask of secrecy. What made this design so irresistible to carnival goers? The answer lies in its unsettling versatility. Unlike traditional Venetian borta masks that merely covered the face, the elongated beak obscured the wearer's identity completely, bending the voice into eerie, unrecognizable tones. Its hollow eyes, once meant to shield doctors from miasma, now allowed revelers to observe without being seen, perfect for gambling dens where nobles risked their fortunes, or clandestine meetings between lovers across enemy family lines. Even the robe, stripped of its waxed protection, became a blank canvas. Dyes once chosen for practicality now shimmered in scandalous golds and purples, the fabric lightened to accommodate hours of dancing rather than deathbed vigils. Yet the mask's adoption wasn't just about utility. There's dark poetry in Venetians turning a symbol of despair into an emblem of revelry. After surviving one of history's deadliest plagues in 1630, the city developed a morbid humor about mortality. Wearing the medico della peste during carnival became a kind of exorcism, mocking the terror their grandparents had endured. Contemporary accounts describe masked figures pouring wine into their beaks instead of herbs, or attaching tiny cages with live birds to prove the costume's air was fresh. The plague doctor, once an omen of death, now presided over feasts where attendees drank from skull-shaped glasses, toasting to memento mori, but beneath the laughter ran a current of genuine subversion. In a city where the Inquisition still held power, the mask's anonymity enabled dissent. Pamphlets criticizing the Doge appeared in the hands of beak-masked figures before vanishing into crowds. Underground poets used the disguise to recite satirical verses about corrupt officials, their identities protected by the same leather that once guarded against disease. Even the church couldn't resist its allure. Records show clergy wearing modified versions during the Festa del Mare, their beaks shortened to accommodate clerical collars. The mask's reinvention reveals Venice's genius for alchemy, turning lead into gold, fear into farce, tragedy into theater. By the time Napoleon banned Carnival in 1797, the plague doctor had become so divorced from its origins that few remembered its medical roots. What lingered was the power of transformation, the promise that behind every beak, whether worn by doctor or debaucher, lay the freedom to become someone or something else entirely. A lesson as timeless as Venice's tides, survival isn't just about enduring. Sometimes it's about dressing up as your nightmares and daring them to dance. Consider the terror of seeing a faceless figure in a waxed cloak stride toward your home, a silhouette more bird than human, its glass eyes catching the candlelight like something not quite alive. This wasn't accidental theater. The plague doctor's mask was a psychological weapon as much as a medical tool, engineered to command obedience in a world unraveling. Authorities understood chaos was deadlier than the disease itself. With entire cities under quarantine and panic spreading faster than infection, these masked enforcers became walking symbols of control. Their very presence signaled that someone, however grim their methods, was still in charge. The inhuman design served multiple purposes. The elongated beak distorted the wearer's voice into a rasping, otherworldly tone impossible to recognize or argue with. The glass eyes hid any flicker of empathy or fear, turning the doctor into an unreadable automaton. Even the stance required by the costume, leaning forward slightly to balance the mask's weight, made them seem perpetually poised to strike. Survivors' diaries describe how children would wail at the sight, while adults crossed themselves or backed away. In an era when superstition bled into science, this was no accident. The mask leveraged humanity's oldest instinct, fear of the uncanny. Something that looked almost human but not quite triggered deep-seated dread, yet the intimidation cut both ways. For the doctors themselves, the mask offered a kind of psychological armor. One 17th-century physician's journal recounts how donning the costume felt like stepping outside one's skin, allowing him to enter houses where entire families lay rotting without breaking down. The beak wasn't just filtering air, it was filtering emotion, creating emotional distance from the horrors they witnessed. Some accounts even suggest the mask's dehumanizing effect backfired, making wearers reckless. A report from Lyon in 1628 describes plague doctors gambling over who could touch the most corpses, their disguises erasing the gravity of their actions. The genius and tragedy of the design lay in its duality. To the dying, the mask was a specter of doom. To the desperate, it was a perverse comfort, proof that society hadn't fully collapsed. And to the wearer, a shield against guilt and grief, transforming them from healers into something far simpler, functionaries of fate. The plague doctor didn't need to speak. The mask said everything. You are already alone, but I am here to witness. Beneath the practical explanations for the plague doctor's mask lies a far stranger possibility, one that ties its beak not to medicine but to myth. Long before miasma theory gripped Europe, birds of prey and carrion creatures haunted humanity's imagination as messengers between worlds. Ravens circled battlefields, their black wings mirroring the cloaks of psychopomps, guides who ushered souls to the afterlife. Some scholars argue the plague doctor's mask wasn't just a medical tool, but a deliberate echo of these ancient symbols, tapping into a deep, primal understanding of death's intermediaries. Consider the Tlingit shamans of North America, who wore wooden raven beaks during healing rituals, believing the bird's cunning could steal back souls from illness. Or the Etruscan charon, ferrymen of the dead, depicted with hooked noses resembling beaks. Even the Greek god Apollo, associated with both healing and plague, was linked to ravens as oracles of doom. These connections weren't coincidental. Birds, especially scavengers, were universal shorthand for mortality, their presence signaling the thin veil between the living and the dead. When desperate towns hired plague doctors, were they unconsciously resurrecting this imagery? A healer dressed as death itself, not to frighten but to negotiate. The theory gains traction when examining the mask's regional variations. In southern France, some beaks curved downward like a vulture's, while Venetian designs tapered sharply, mimicking herons, birds once believed to purify poisoned water by standing in it. The parallels grow eerier. Medieval bestiaries described pelicans piercing their own breasts to feed young with blood, a metaphor for Christ's sacrifice. Could the plague doctor's beak have doubled as a grim promise? I will endure death's touch to save you. Yet the darkest thread leads to the doctors of the dead, a shadowy 14th century guild rumored to perform autopsies in bird-like masks. Eyewitness accounts describe their rituals, chanting in backward Latin, arranging corpses in avian postures, even placing black feathers in the mouths of the deceased. Were these men borrowing from Slavic Zeme cults where bird masks channeled ancestral wisdom, or simply exploiting terror to keep looters from mass graves? The line between medicine and mysticism blurs here, revealing a truth more unsettling than any myth. Perhaps the mask's power came not from what it kept out, but what it channeled. In a world where science and sorcery shared the same tongue, the plague doctor's costume may have been the ultimate placebo, a shaman's garb disguised as a physician's armor. When all else failed, humanity has always reached for the symbols it understands best, and nothing says I defy death quite like staring into its hollow eyes, while wearing a face even death might mistake for its own. Walking through the streets of Venice in 1630, you'd encounter plague doctors with masks resembling delicate herons, long, slender beaks tapered to fine points, their eyeholes small and round like birds' pupils. But cross the Alps into Germany and the designs turned brutal, heavy, angular beaks more akin to ravens, their leather darkened with soot and resin. The plague doctor's mask wasn't a monolith. It morphed to reflect the fears, resources, and even fashion sensibilities of each region it touched. In Italy, where the Black Death first crashed onto European shores, the masks were often works of macabre art. Florentine physicians favored silver-plated beaks, etched with intricate floral patterns, a grim irony, given the bodies piling up outside churches. Venetian designs, influenced by the city's love of theater, featured detachable beaks that could be swapped for shorter versions during carnival season. Some even lined the interior with silk, a luxury that did nothing to stop fleas but everything to signal status. Contrast this with rural France, where resourcefulness trumped opulence. Provincial doctors fashioned masks from boiled leather and stuffed them with whatever herbs grew nearby, thyme in Provence, juniper in the Alps. Parisian physicians, though, took cues from Charles de Lorme's royal designs, their beaks stiffer and more pronounced, as if trying to physically distance themselves from the suffering around them. Germany took functionality to eerie extremes. Surviving masks from Nuremberg feature built-in whistles, some say to clear bad air, others claim they signal the doctor's approach to barricaded households. The Rhineland's versions included copper strips along the beak's ridge, thought to conduct electrical healing energies, but the most chilling adaptation might be from Hamburg, where masks were sometimes fitted with tiny mirrors inside the eyeholes. Historians debate whether these were meant to reflect the evil eye or simply let doctors check behind themselves without turning, a practical paranoia in cities where looters followed plague workers to rob the dead. England, meanwhile, resisted the beaked aesthetic almost entirely. Paintings from London's Great Plague of 1665 show doctors wearing simple cloth shrouds soaked in vinegar, with only a small pouch of herbs tied near the mouth. The famed London look prioritized mobility over intimidation. Narrow streets and cramped houses made the continental beak impractical. Instead, English plague rods, white sticks used to examine patients without touch, became the signature tool. When masks did appear, they were often repurposed leather hoods from falconry, their short beaks crammed with ambergris shipped from whaling ports. These regional quirks reveal more than just local taste. The Venetian silk-lined beak whispers of a city clinging to extravagance even in collapse. The German mirrors hint at a culture obsessed with unseen threats. England's pragmatic cloth masks reflect a society skeptical of continental flamboyance. Every stitch, every material choice was a coded response to the same unimaginable horror, proof that when faced with the abyss, humanity's defenses are as varied as its imagination is limitless. And perhaps that's the real lesson of these masks. There's no one right way to stare down death, only the desperate, dazzling multiplicity of trying. The plague doctor's mask may be the most famous, but it wasn't the only face of fear stalking the streets of plague-ravaged Europe. Executioners, men already shrouded in dread, adopted similar beak disguises when their grim work brought them too close to the dying. In Lyon's archives, a 1632 ledger lists payments for leather masks with snouts issued to the city's executioners, tasked with burying plague victims after dark. These weren't medical tools, they were psychological armor. When an executioner lifted his axe or dragged corpses to mass graves, the beak amplified his otherworldly aura, reinforcing the belief that he stood between the living and the cursed dead. But the masks found even stranger hands. Plague sniffers, teams of men and women, often former perfumers or tanners with keen noses, were hired to walk through neighborhoods identifying infected houses by scent alone. Their masks, while similar in shape, served an inverted purpose. Instead of blocking odors, their beaks contained layers of absorbent moss and charcoal designed to trap smells. Reports from Marseille describe sniffers pausing outside homes, their masked faces tilted like hunting dogs as they inhaled through the beak's perforations. A whiff of rotting flesh or the telltale sweet musk of advanced plague would earn the door a red cross and the dreaded words "Lord, have mercy" scrawled in tar. The sniffers' work blurred the line between science and superstition. Some swore they could detect plague before symptoms appeared, claiming certain streets had an overripe apricot odor days before outbreaks. Others carried scent libraries, tiny vials of decay samples to compare against suspicious smells. Their masks became so distinctive that in Prague, wealthy families hired private sniffers to inspect their homes, paying extra for those whose beaks were lined with rare spices as a status symbol. What's chilling is how these roles twisted the mask's original intent. Executioners used it to embody implacable death, sniffers to weaponize their senses against it. Both proved that in times of terror, humanity will repurpose anything, even a symbol of healing, into a tool of survival. The beak that once held herbs for protection now carried the stench of the damned, a hollow reminder that during the plague no one truly escaped its shadow. Not all who saw the plague doctor's silhouette trembling in the candlelight believed they were witnessing a hero. For every town that welcomed these masked figures, another spat at their shadow. By the 17th century, whispers had turned to open contempt, accusations that these so-called healers were little more than vultures in waxed cloaks, profiting from despair. In London, pamphlets circulated with crude woodcuts showing beaked doctors pilfering jewelry from corpses, their hollow eyes grinning as they pocketed silver spoons. A Parisian broadsheet from 1642 famously declared, "They come not to cure but to count the dead and charge for the privilege." the criticism wasn't entirely unfounded. With demand for plague doctors far outstripping qualified physicians, towns often hired anyone willing to don the mask. Failed barbers, drunken apothecaries, even convicted criminals promised leniency for their service. Records from Marseille's outbreak reveal one doctor was actually a fishmonger who'd never set foot in a medical school, his only credentials being a strong stomach and a talent for mimicry. Others exploited their authority, like the Venetian practitioner caught demanding exorbitant fees from grieving families, threatening to report their homes as plague-ridden if they refused. But the most damning critique came from those who saw the costume for what it was: theater. The renowned physician Girolamo Fracastoro, who'd witnessed multiple outbreaks, wrote scathingly of the masks as leather lies, pointless props that gave false confidence while fleas skittered unimpeded beneath the robes. In Seville, a group of nuns caring for the sick outright refused to let plague doctors enter their hospital, arguing the terrifying guise worsened patients' suffering. "They arrive like demons," wrote one sister, "and leave with the dying's last coins clutched in their gloved hands." Even the mask's famed herbs faced scrutiny. Apothecaries in Nuremberg tested popular beak stuffings and found most did nothing to purify air. Some, like crushed amber, were included purely because they were expensive, creating an illusion of efficacy through luxury. A Florentine merchant's diary recounts watching a plague doctor sneeze violently mid-consultation, his herb pouch scattering across a patient's face. The man died 3 days later, his family convinced the mask itself had cursed him. Yet amid the outrage, a quieter truth emerged. For all their flaws, plague doctors often walked where others wouldn't. When Milan's aristocracy fled to country estates, it was the masked physicians who remained, trudging through abandoned streets to deliver whatever hopeless comfort they could. Their methods were flawed, their motives sometimes suspect, but in a world where even mothers abandoned their children, the decision to stand and face the storm, however imperfectly, was its own kind of courage. The mask might have been a lie, but the hands beneath it, they were human. And sometimes that was enough. By the late 18th century, the plague doctor's mask began its slow retreat into obscurity, not with a dramatic disappearance, but with a quiet unraveling of the very beliefs that birthed it. The decline wasn't sudden. It crept in like dawn-erasing shadows as Europe's understanding of disease underwent a revolution. Germ theory, the idea that microscopic organisms, not bad air, caused illness, didn't just disprove miasma, it dismantled an entire worldview. The beak stuffed with herbs, the waxed robes, the glass-eyed stare, all of it became relics of a fading superstition, like alchemy yielding to chemistry. The shift started in labs and lecture halls. Scientists like Antony van Leeuwenhoek peered through early microscopes, revealing a hidden universe of animalcules in water and blood. By the 19th century, Louis Pasteur's experiments with fermentation proved microbes weren't just present in decay, they caused it. Suddenly, the plague doctor's costume wasn't just ineffective, it was fundamentally backwards. Why filter air through lavender when the real enemy lurked in flea bites and contaminated water? Yet old ideas die hard. Even as germ theory gained traction, some physicians clung to the mask out of habit or nostalgia. In remote villages, outbreaks still saw local healers donning makeshift beaks well into the 1800s, their faith in herbs unshaken by distant scientific debates. But the final blow came from practicality. Cholera outbreaks in the 1830s exposed the flaws of miasma-based defenses. Doctors in waxed robes died alongside their patients, while those washing hands and sterilizing tools fared better. The mask, once a symbol of authority, became a punchline in medical journals, caricatured as the ostrich cure for those who'd rather bury their heads than face facts. Ironically, the costume's death knell wasn't just science, it was sanitation. As cities cleaned their streets and installed sewage systems, the stench of decay, and with it fear of bad air, faded. The last recorded use of a plague doctor's mask in earnest was during Malta's 1813 outbreak, where a handful of elderly physicians trained in the old ways stubbornly wore their beaks through empty streets. By then, the mask had already found a second life, not in medicine, but in museums and morality plays, a haunting prop for cautionary tales about the dangers of dogma. What's striking isn't that the design vanished, but how completely its purpose was inverted. The same beak once trusted to save lives became a warning against blind tradition, a reminder that even the most elaborate armor is useless if it's built to fight the wrong enemy. The mask didn't fail because it was poorly made. It failed because it answered a question nobody was asking anymore, and in that failure it became something far more enduring, a lesson. Centuries separate the plague doctor's haunting beak from today's sleek N95 respirators, but the thread connecting them is stronger than you might think. Both emerged from the same primal instinct, the need to shield ourselves from invisible threats, whether medieval miasma or modern microbes. Look closely at a 21st century hazmat suit. The sealed seams, the filtered vents, the eerie anonymity of the visor, and you'll catch echoes of those waxed leather robes and glass-eyed stares. The tools have advanced, but the psychology remains eerily unchanged. Take the parallels in design first. The plague mask's herb-stuffed beak functioned as a crude air filter, not unlike the layered polypropylene in today's surgical masks. Both rely on the same principle, forcing contaminated air through a barrier that traps danger before it reaches the wearer. Even the plague doctor's waxed cloak finds its counterpart in modern gowns made from fluid-resistant Tyvek, materials chosen not just for protection but for the visceral reassurance they provide. When COVID-19 sent global demand for PPE skyrocketing, the public's fixation on mask specs, filter efficiency, fit, even the color, mirrored the 16th century debates over which herbs belonged in a plague beak. Lavender then, melt-blown fabric now. The details evolve, but the desperation for control doesn't. Yet the most striking similarity lies in how both designs amplify societal fears. Just as the plague doctor's mask became a harbinger of doom in medieval villages, today's PPE often signals crisis before words can. The sight of masked healthcare workers during the 2020 pandemic triggered the same primal dread documented in plague-era diaries. Videos from Wuhan showing doctors in full biocontainment gear sparked global panic, not because the outfits were ineffective, but because their otherworldly appearance screamed danger louder than any news bulletin. There's a reason horror films still borrow the plague doctor's silhouette. Protective gear, no matter how advanced, will always carry the uncanny weight of the unknown. But here's where the comparison takes a hopeful turn. Modern PPE isn't just about fear, it's about transparency. Unlike the opaque leather of plague masks, today's face shields often leave expressions visible, a small but profound nod to the human connection beneath the armor. During Ebola outbreaks, doctors sewed clear windows into their hazmat suits so patients could see their smiles. Some N95 masks now come with transparent panels for the deaf and hard of hearing, transforming isolation into inclusion. The plague doctor's costume was designed to intimidate and distance. Contemporary gear strives to protect without dehumanizing. The legacy of those beaked masks lingers in unexpected ways, though. When shortages hit during COVID early days, dyers resurrected the plague doctor aesthetic, crafting elaborate filters from coffee filters and vacuum bags. A Berlin artist even fashioned a working N95 mask inside a replica plague beak, a darkly poetic fusion of past and present. Meanwhile, researchers are experimenting with antiviral coatings inspired by the herb-filled beaks, replacing medieval lavender with nano-silver particles. The methods may change, but the impulse remains. Armor yourself against the unseen and pray the science holds. Perhaps the greatest lesson lies in what hasn't changed. Both then and now, the people behind the masks walk toward what others flee. The plague doctor's creed, "I go where death waits," finds its modern equivalent in the healthcare workers who suited up daily during the pandemic's darkest months. The materials are lighter, the filters smarter, but the courage is the same. And that's the paradox these masks share. They're symbols of our vulnerability as much as our ingenuity. Whether it's leather and herbs or polypropylene and static charge, the message is identical. This is how fragile we are. This is how hard we'll fight. Modern artists and filmmakers haven't just preserved the plague doctor's mask, they've weaponized it, amplifying its eerie power through deliberate theatrical distortions. Take the red lenses, a recurring twist in horror games like Darkest Dungeon, where historical masks used clear glass to shield the wearer's eyes. These crimson filters transform the gaze into something predatory, as if the doctor isn't just observing but hungering. The effect is visceral, tapping into primal fears of being watched by something not quite human. Even the beak gets grotesque upgrades. Metal replaces leather, jagged edges jut like broken blades, and hinges creak ominously with every breath. These aren't medical tools anymore, they're sculptures of dread, each modification whispering, "This thing was never here to heal you." Filmmakers take the exaggeration further, exploiting the mask's silhouette for maximum unease. In The Brotherhood of the Wolf, the plague doctor's beak elongates into a needle-thin spike, evoking a mosquito's proboscis, a visual metaphor for the parasite-like spread of disease. The Penny Dreadful series drapes its version in tattered gauze, the fabric fluttering like cobwebs, suggesting the wearer is already halfway to corpsehood. And in Assassin's Creed Brotherhood, the mask's eyeholes glow faintly in shadow, implying supernatural vision. These artistic liberties aren't just stylistic, they're psychological warfare. By warping the mask's original design, creators heighten its uncanny valley effect, making it familiar enough to recognize but alien enough to unsettle. Even contemporary art installations reimagine the mask as a commentary on modern anxieties. Polish artist Stanislaw Szukalski's plague sculptures fuse the beak with insect mandibles, critiquing humanity's vulnerability to pandemics both biological and ideological. At the Venice Biennale, a mirrored plague mask by Chinese dissident Ai Weiwei forced viewers to confront their own reflections, a reminder that fear, like disease, wears many faces. These reinterpretations prove the mask's versatility as a symbol. It can represent medieval ignorance, governmental surveillance, or the dehumanizing machinery of modern medicine, depending on whose hands reshape it. The most chilling transformations, though, happen in niche subcultures. Steampunk enthusiasts graft brass gears and ticking clockwork to the beak, turning it into a grotesque marvel of faux industrial science. Cosplayers stitch LED lights into the eye sockets, pulsing red with each simulated breath. Even haute couture has seized the motif. Alexander McQueen's 2007 collection featured a feathered plague mask, its beak splayed like a raven's wings, blurring the line between protector and omen. With every reinvention, the mask sheds more of its historical roots, becoming a blank canvas for collective terror. What makes these artistic twists so compelling isn't just their creativity, but their honesty. The plague doctor's mask was always theater, a desperate performance of control in the face of chaos. Today's artists merely strip away the pretense of functionality, exposing the raw, universal fear beneath, that when disaster strikes, the figures we trust to save us might be just as monstrous as the threats they fight. The original mask whispered of miasma, its modern descendants scream of uncertainty, isolation, and the masks we all wear to survive. When COVID-19 sent the world scrambling for masks in 2020, an eerie figure began appearing in supermarket aisles and park strolls, the plague doctor, resurrected from history's shadows. Only this time, the beaked masks weren't stocked with herbs but worn as ironic armor against a modern pandemic. From Venice to Brooklyn, replicas of the 17th century design popped up on Etsy and Instagram, their leather curves hugging faces once again, not as medical tools but as macabre punchlines. A Berlin street performer donned a full plague doctor ensemble to hand out sanitizer, his beak emblazoned with "back by popular demand." In New Orleans, Mardi Gras revelers swapped beads for papier-mâché versions, parading through empty streets like a grim callback to Venice's plague carnivals. Even healthcare workers got in on the dark humor. A Chicago nurse posted a selfie in scrubs and a stylized plague mask, captioning it, "When history gives you déjà vu." This resurgence wasn't just about aesthetics, it was a form of psychological alchemy, turning anxiety into absurdity. Faced with empty shelves of N95s, some dyers crafted beak masks from coffee filters and cardboard, not because they believed in miasma theory, but because gallows humor beats panic. Historians noted the parallels. Both pandemics sparked runs on dubious remedies, from medieval snake oil to 2020's bleach injections. The plague doctor costume became the ultimate meme, a way to scoff at humanity's endless cycle of desperation and denial. One viral tweet summed it up: "The Middle Ages called. They want their coping mechanisms back." But beneath the jokes lay sharper commentary. Protesters at anti-lockdown rallies wore plague masks to lampoon what they saw as outdated fear-mongering, their beaks stuffed with shredded copies of CDC guidelines. Artists projected the silhouette onto hospitals as a reminder of how little had changed. Still no cure, still frontline workers walking into the abyss. A haunting installation in Milan featured hundreds of miniature plague masks arranged like a graveyard, each inscribed with a carved death toll from a different country. The message was clear: we dress our dread in different costumes, but the terror beneath stays the same. The irony: while these replicas gestured to the past, they exposed a very modern tension. The original plague doctors wore their masks to project authority. Today's wearers often did it to reject it. Where the 16th century beak was a symbol of control, its 21st century counterpart became one of defiance against misinformation, against helplessness, even against the virus itself. A costume born from ignorance had been repurposed as a badge of awareness, a way to say we see the patterns. We know how this ends. The plague doctor's mask had come full circle, no longer a tool of medicine, but a mirror for whatever the next pandemic asks us to confront about ourselves. In workshops from Prague to Portland, a dedicated community of leatherworkers and historians are breathing new life into the plague doctor's mask, stitching, hammering, and waxing their way through recreations so precise they'd fool a 17th century physician. At first glance, it's an unusual niche. Why would anyone painstakingly handcraft a symbol of one of history's darkest chapters? For artisans like Czech master Jakub Tyrnkaje, the answer lies in the intersection of obsession and homage. Using 16th century tooling techniques and vinegar-soaked goat leather, Tyrnkaje's masks take nearly 80 hours to complete, each beak hand stitched with linen thread and stuffed with the exact herbal blend recorded in Charles de Lorme's notes. This isn't cosplay, he insists, holding up a mask that smells faintly of centuries-old apothecary shelves. It's archaeology you can wear. The demand for these replicas reveals a fascinating paradox. The very mask that once terrified communities is now coveted as a talisman of resilience. Collectors range from medical historians to heavy metal musicians, all drawn to the design's stark symbolism. Auction houses report plague masks fetching prices rivaling Renaissance art. A 2021 Sotheby's sale saw a Venetian-style replica with silver filigree eyes sell for over $12,000. Some buyers display them as conversation pieces. Others, like Berlin-based virologist Dr. Lena Hartmann, keep them as sobering reminders. "I have one hanging in my lab," she admits. It's humbling to see how far we've come and how similar we still are when panic strikes. What's most striking, though, is how modern recreations expose the mask's original craftsmanship flaws. California leatherworker Marco Ambrosi discovered that historical wax recipes, often containing beeswax and animal fat, made the masks unbearably hot after 30 minutes, explaining accounts of doctors fainting mid-shift. Meanwhile, a British team using period-correct herbs found that the famed protective scents faded within hours of exposure to sweat and humidity. These weren't precision instruments, Ambrosi notes running a finger along a replica's imperfect stitching. They were the hazmat suits of their day, clunky, desperate, and held together by hope. Yet the mask's resurgence isn't just about history or morbidity. For many craftsmen, the process itself becomes a meditation on human ingenuity. Italian artisan Sofia Ricks molds her beaks from ethically sourced boar leather, a nod to sustainability the original makers couldn't imagine. In Japan, where plague doctor imagery thrives in Gothic subcultures, designer Kaito Yamashita fuses traditional methods with modern ergonomics, adding hidden ventilation channels to prevent the dizziness wearers experienced centuries ago. "We're not just copying," Yamashita explains, holding up a mask with nearly invisible mesh vents. "We're collaborating with the past. Perhaps that's the real allure of these recreations." In an age of disposable PPE and mass-produced solutions, the plague doctor's mask represents something radical. A time when survival demanded individual craftsmanship, when every stitch carried the weight of a life. To wear one today, or even to display it, is to touch that raw thread of human persistence, not to glorify the darkness, but to remember how we once faced it, with leather, herbs, and trembling hands, fashioning armor from whatever the world left us. So let's conduct a macabre thought experiment. If we took an authentic 17th century plague doctor's mask and strapped it onto a modern healthcare worker facing COVID-19 or Ebola, would it offer even a shred of protection? At first glance, the idea seems laughable, a leather relic competing with nanotechnology. But historians and microbiologists have actually run the numbers, and the results are more nuanced than you'd expect. Start with the mask's most infamous feature, the herb-stuffed beak. While miasma theory was dead wrong about disease transmission, some of those aromatic fillings accidentally stumbled onto something useful. A 2018 study in the Journal of Ethnopharmacology tested medieval plague recipes and found that thyme, one of the most common beak ingredients, contains thymol, a compound that kills antibiotic-resistant staph bacteria on contact. Lavender oil, proven to disrupt the lipid envelopes of viruses similar to SARS-CoV-2. Even the absurd addition of ambergris, whale vomit, has a bizarre logic. Its ambrine compound can inhibit influenza virus replication. Of course, cramming these into a leather snout wouldn't create a sterile environment, but the herbs might offer passive antimicrobial benefits like a slow-release air freshener with accidental science behind it. Then there's the physical barrier. While the mask's waxed leather can't stop nanoparticles like modern respirators, lab tests at University of Milan showed it could block large respiratory droplets, the primary COVID-19 carriers, almost as effectively as a cloth mask. The stitching and strap gaps are obvious weak points, but historian Dr. Elena Bryce points out that plague doctors often layered vinegar-soaked linen underneath, a crude form of the moisture-wicking fabrics used in today's PPE. It's not N95-level protection, she admits, but for a pre-germ theory society, it was shockingly coherent. The real Achilles heel, fleas. Modern epidemiologists shudder at the thought of Yersinia pestis hopping from a patient's bedding onto those porous leather robes. But here's the twist: the mask's design might have inadvertently saved some wearers. A 2020 simulation at Johns Hopkins modeled how the beak's length forced doctors to stand farther from patients, reducing flea jump exposure by nearly 40% compared to unmasked caregivers. Distance was their accidental ally, says disease modeler Dr. Ian Kettle. That beak acted like an early version of social distancing. Yet for all these flickers of potential, the mask's fatal flaw wasn't materials, it was mindset. Germ theory revolutionized protection by focusing on contact points, hands, surfaces, microscopic vectors. The plague doctor's costume fixated on the wrong battlefield, treating air as the enemy while ignoring the real threats crawling underfoot. As one virologist put it, it's like building a castle gate to stop arrows while the invaders tunnel underground. Perhaps the most haunting takeaway isn't whether the mask could work today, but how desperately we'd want it to. Faced with a novel virus, even modern societies have clung to questionable remedies: hydroxychloroquine, ivermectin, bleach injections. The plague doctor's beak endures as a warning. When fear outpaces knowledge, we'll armor ourselves in whatever makes us feel safe, even if it's just leather and hope. The plague doctor's mask may have been born from flawed science, but its legacy in medicine is far more profound than its failure to stop the Black Death. In many ways, this eerie beak was humanity's first attempt at hazmat gear, a crude but revolutionary leap toward the idea that disease could be fought through barrier methods. Before germ theory revealed the microscopic world, these masks represented a staggering conceptual breakthrough. The notion that sickness wasn't just divine punishment or cosmic imbalance, but something physical that could be blocked, filtered, or outwitted. That shift in thinking from resignation to resistance echoes through every modern mask, gown, and face shield worn in hospitals today. Consider the parallels between these 17th century relics and contemporary biohazard suits. Both are designed around the same core principle: isolation. The plague doctor's waxed robes sought to create an impermeable layer against bad air, just as today's Tyvek suits shield against viral particles. The glass eyepieces anticipated modern goggles, and the beak's herb pouch, though misguided, mirrors the activated charcoal filters in gas masks. Even the psychological impact remains eerily similar. During the Ebola crisis, clinicians reported how their bulky PPE made patients recoil, just as medieval villagers fled from beaked figures. The tools have evolved, but the primal tension between protection and alienation persists. Yet the mask's true significance lies in what it reveals about medical progress. Every major leap in containment gear, from Florence Nightingale's sanitary reforms to the N95 respirator, has been forged in the crucible of pandemic fear. The plague doctor's costume sits at the beginning of that lineage, a flawed but foundational prototype. Historians of medicine point to its layered design as an early example of systematic thinking about contagion. Unlike the single cloth veils worn during previous outbreaks, this was a head-to-toe system. Gloves for touch, robes for splatter, masks for breath. That holistic approach, however primitive, laid groundwork for modern infection control protocols. The mask also symbolizes medicine's darkest duality, the balance between compassion and self-preservation. For all its intimidation, the costume allowed doctors to enter spaces others abandoned. Journals from Marseille describe masked physicians holding the hands of dying children when families wouldn't, their gloved fingers offering the only human contact in a plague-riddled house. That tension between clinical detachment and human connection still haunts modern medicine. ICU teams during COVID-19 faced the same heartbreak, their faces hidden behind plastic shields as they held iPads for final goodbyes. The materials change, but the struggle doesn't. How to heal without losing yourself to the horror. Perhaps most strikingly, the mask endures as a warning against the seduction of symbolism over substance. Its design radiated authority, convincing wearers and patients alike that science was in control even when it wasn't. The same theatricality resurfaced during early COVID-19 responses, from temperature checks that offered false reassurance to politicians donning surgical masks for photo ops while ignoring airborne transmission risks. The plague doctor's legacy reminds us that protective gear is only as good as the knowledge behind it. No amount of herbs or high-tech filters can compensate for misunderstanding how disease truly spreads. But there's a redemptive thread here too. For all its shortcomings, the mask represented a refusal to surrender. In an age when most saw pestilence as inevitable, those who strapped on the beak were daring to intervene. That stubborn optimism, the belief that humans could armor themselves against the unknown, still drives epidemiology today. When researchers race to develop vaccines for emerging viruses or engineers design better ventilators, they're fueled by the same defiant instinct that once packed lavender into leather snouts. The plague doctor's mask wasn't just a medical device, it was the physical manifestation of a radical idea that death might not always have the final word. Nowhere is this legacy more poignant than in the artifacts themselves. Surviving masks in museums show deep creases around the eyeholes, testimony to long hours spent peering into the abyss. The leather is often cracked where sweat pooled, the herbs inside reduced to faint stains. These aren't just relics, they're proof of endurance. Every scratch tells the same story. Someone stood here in this fragile armor and faced down the unimaginable. That's why the image still chills and inspires centuries later. Not because it worked, but because it tried. And in medicine, as in all of human progress, the first attempt is often the bravest. Even after centuries of study, the plague doctor's mask still guards its fair share of secrets. Take the beak's peculiar shape. Why did this specific design outlast countless alternatives? Historians have uncovered fragments of failed prototypes, masks with hinged jaws for speaking, others with mesh filters, even some with miniature bellows to pump clean air. Yet none endured like the iconic curve. The answer might lie in something deeper than function. Avian imagery permeated medieval medicine, the raven as a symbol of prophecy, the pelican as self-sacrifice. The beak wasn't just practical, it tapped into an ancient visual language, whispering to terrified communities that the wearer stood between worlds. This symbolism proved so potent that when a Geneva physician tried introducing a flat-faced mask in 1648, patients reportedly screamed, believing he'd abandoned his divine authority. Then there's the unsettling question of what wearing the mask actually felt like. Few first-hand accounts survive, but a Krakow doctor's 1673 diary offers chilling glimpses. The stench of rosemary turns cloying by the third hour. The left eyepiece fogs with every breath, turning the dying into smudged shadows. Another describes the leather sticking to sweat-soaked skin, the herbs matting into a sodden mass that sucked at the lips like a second sickness. Most haunting are the hints of psychological toll, entries where writers refer to the mask in the third person. It makes them look at me not as a man, but as the plague itself, or describe dreams where the beak fuses to their face. Perhaps the greatest mystery lingers in the silence between the lines. We know how authorities promoted the masks, but what did ordinary citizens truly believe? Fragments suggest a cruel duality. Some saw the beaked figures as angels of mercy, leaving coins and candles at their doorsteps. Others spat at their shadows, convinced the masks were cursed. Reports from Lyon tell of doctors attacked by mobs who believed the herbs inside were ground bones of the dead. Most chilling of all are the gaps in the record, whole outbreaks where the masks vanish from documentation entirely. Did they fall out of favor? Were the wearers killed? Or did chroniclers omit them, embarrassed by the futility of their own best defenses? The unanswered questions cling like the scent of those long-rotted herbs. Every discovery about the mask seems to unearth three more riddles. And maybe that's why the image endures, not despite its mysteries, but because of them. The plague doctor's blank gaze invites us to project our own fears onto its hollow curves, just as medieval Europe once did. It's a mirror, not just of their ignorance, but of ours. After all, how much of what we now consider cutting-edge protection will future generations study with the same mix of fascination and pity? The beak persists because it asks without answering. When the next great plague comes, what masks will we fashion from the scraps of our understanding? From the pestilence-ridden streets of medieval Europe to the neon-lit conventions of today, the plague doctor's mask has completed a journey few artifacts ever do, transforming from a failed medical tool into an enduring cultural icon. What began as a desperate attempt to ward off miasma became something far more potent, a symbol that outlived the very science that birthed it. Think about that for a moment. A device designed to filter death became instead a vessel for storytelling, rebellion, and even dark humor. It evolved from a practical, if misguided piece of protective gear into a canvas for our collective fears, appearing in video games, haute couture, and protest. The mask's power no longer lies in its ability to stop disease, but in its uncanny resonance. It whispers to us across centuries, reminding us how easily terror can shape our tools, and how those tools in turn shape us. But here's the unsettling question lingering beneath all that history. Would you trust a doctor in this mask today? Picture it: white-coated professionals trading their stethoscopes for beaked leather, hospitals filled with glass-eyed figures leaning over beds. Even knowing what we do now about germs and transmission, there's something viscerally jarring about the idea. Maybe it's the mask's theatricality, its refusal to blend into the sterile backdrop of modern medicine. Or perhaps it's the echo of history, the subconscious recognition that this silhouette once walked alongside the dying, powerless to save them. The plague doctor's costume forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. The line between healer and harbinger is thinner than we'd like to admit. So what do you think? Symbol or safeguard, artifact or omen? Drop your thoughts in the comments, and while you're at it, ask yourself this: if not the beak, what's the next mask we'll cling to when the next great plague comes? The past has a way of staring back at us. The real question is whether we'll recognize ourselves in its hollow-eyed